when a wealthy woman publicly humiliated a black waiter for getting her wine order wrong. She had no idea he was about to expose knowledge that would leave her speechless and change his life forever. The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the marble floor of Grandview Country Club as the evening's most exclusive charity auction was about to begin. The scent of aged oak from the wine cellar mixed with expensive perfumes, creating an atmosphere thick with privilege and expectation. Among the sea of designer gowns and tailored suits, Marcus Thompson moved silently between the tables. His black uniform pristine, his movements efficient and nearly invisible to the wealthy patrons he served. At 28, Marcus had perfected the art of being present, but unseen. His dark hands moved with practiced precision, refilling crystal water glasses and adjusting silverware with the kind of attention to detail that went unnoticed by those who expected perfection. The conversations around him flowed about stock, portfolios, vacation homes in the Hamptons, and charitable tax deductions, while he navigated through their world like a ghost. "Excuse me, waiter," came a sharp voice that cut through the ambient chatter like a blade. Mrs. Victoria Ashford, draped in pearls that cost more than most people's cars, sat at table 7 with her husband, philanthropist Richard Ashford. Her lips were pressed into a thin line of displeasure as she stared at the wine glass before her. "This Chateau Margaux is completely wrong. I specifically requested the 2005 vintage, not this inferior 2007. Marcus approached respectfully, his voice soft but clear. "I apologize, ma'am. Let me check with our sommelier about the vintage you requested." "Don't apologize. Fix it," Victoria snapped, her voice rising just enough for neighboring tables to take notice. "Do you have any idea what we pay for membership here? Or are you too busy daydreaming to focus on doing your job properly?" What none of them knew was that Marcus could distinguish a 2005 Chateau Margaux from a 2007 with his eyes closed. He could tell them about the rainfall patterns that year, the early harvest that created the wine's distinctive mineral notes, and exactly why the 2005 was considered superior. He knew because he had spent 4 years studying at the prestigious Culinary Institute, specializing in wine and hospitality management, graduating summa cum laude with dreams of opening his own restaurant. As Victoria continued her tirade, attracting more attention from the surrounding tables, Marcus felt the familiar weight of invisible chains. These people saw his uniform, his skin, his silence, and made their assumptions. They had no idea that in his small apartment, wine journals and business plans covered his kitchen table. They couldn't know that he had sacrificed his dreams to work 3 jobs, supporting his younger sister through medical school after their parents died in a car accident. Richard Ashford sat quietly, his weathered hands folded on the white tablecloth, watching his wife's performance with growing discomfort. At 62, he had built his fortune in real estate, but more importantly, he had built his reputation on treating everyone with dignity. Tonight, that reputation was being challenged by the woman he had loved for 30 years. "Perhaps," Marcus said carefully, his voice maintaining its professional calm, "I could bring you our wine menu so you can select exactly what you'd prefer. Perhaps you could learn to do your job without making me do it for you," Victoria shot back, her voice now clearly audible to half the dining room. Several guests had turned to watch, some with embarrassed expressions, others with the morbid fascination of witnessing a social spectacle. Marcus nodded, turned to leave, but then paused. Something in the way she had dismissed not just him, but the careful craft of wine service sparked something he had kept buried for too long. He turned back, his posture straightening slightly. "Ma'am, with respect, The wine you're drinking is actually the 2005 Chateau Margaux you requested. The 2007 vintage has a more pronounced cassis note and softer tannins, while this bottle displays the signature graphite minerality and structured backbone that made the 2005 vintage legendary among collectors. The room fell silent. Victoria's face flushed crimson, not from embarrassment, but from rage at being corrected by someone she considered beneath her notice. Richard Ashford's eyes widened, not in shock at his wife's humiliation, but in recognition of something extraordinary happening before him. "How dare you?" Victoria began, but her husband's raised hand stopped her mid-sentence. Because sometimes, when people spend so long being invisible, the moment they choose to be seen changes everything around them. And Marcus Thompson was about to discover that some battles are worth fighting, even when you're standing alone against an entire world that refuses to see your worth. Before we continue with Marcus's incredible story, I need you to do something that will help more people discover stories like his. Hit that subscribe button right now, because every week we bring you real stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. People whose voices deserve to be heard. These aren't just feel-good tales, they're powerful reminders that dignity and respect shouldn't depend on your job title or bank account. Now, rate this story so far on a scale of 1 to 10. But here's the thing. If you're already feeling that fire in your chest, that sense of injustice mixed with anticipation, then you know we're just getting started. Drop your rating in the comments and tell us about a time you witnessed someone being treated unfairly because of assumptions people made about them. Because Marcus's story is about to take a turn that nobody in that room saw coming. Marcus Emanuel. Thompson had been working at Grandview Country Club for 18 months, but in many ways, he had been invisible his entire life. Born in Detroit to parents who worked double shifts, his father at Ford, his mother cleaning office buildings, Marcus learned early that hard work and education were the only paths to something better. Every morning at 6 a.m., Marcus arrived at the club through the service entrance, past the dumpsters and delivery trucks, while members drove their luxury cars up the circular driveway lined with perfectly manicured hedges. He would change into his uniform in the basement locker room, check his appearance in the cracked mirror, and transform into the invisible man the club required him to be. The Grandview Country Club was a monument to old money and older prejudices. Established in 1923, its walls held portraits of founding members who had built their fortunes when the world was divided along clearer lines. The current members inherited not just wealth, but attitudes about who belonged where. Marcus moved through their world serving their meals, clearing their plates, and listening to conversations that revealed just how little they understood about struggle, sacrifice, or the dreams of people like him. But Marcus watched. He always watched. He observed how the sommelier, François, could command respect with his knowledge of wines. He noticed how the head chef, even when busy, was treated with deference because of his expertise. He saw that in this world of privilege, knowledge was a form of power, if you were allowed to display it. On that particular evening, as the charity auction preparations reached their peak, Marcus moved between the kitchen and dining room with quiet efficiency. The event was raising money for inner-city youth programs, and the irony wasn't lost on him that none of the people writing checks would ever actually meet the youth they claimed to help. He overheard fragments of conversations as he worked. These charity events are such good networking opportunities. The tax deduction alone makes it worthwhile. I heard they need to raise their diversity numbers on the board. Do we know any qualified minorities? These people talked about helping people like him while barely acknowledging his presence as he served their dinner. When Mrs. Ashford first complained about the wine, Marcus had initially felt the familiar knot in his stomach. the anxiety that came with being publicly criticized for something beyond his control. He had learned to absorb these moments, to nod apologetically and find solutions without defending himself. That was the unspoken rule of service. The customer's anger must never be met with anything but humble acceptance. But as Victoria Ashford's voice grew louder and more condescending, something shifted inside him. Maybe it was the way she emphasized the word waiter like it was an insult. Maybe it was how the other guests were starting to stare, some with pity, others with the uncomfortable excitement of watching someone being humiliated. Or maybe it was the memory of his sister Keisha, calling just that morning to tell him she had been accepted into her surgical residency program. "I'm so proud of you, Marcus," Keisha had said, her voice thick with emotion. "You sacrificed everything for me. Someday, I'm going to make sure the whole world knows how brilliant my brother is." Standing there, watching Victoria Ashford perform her superiority for an audience, Marcus felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Pride in what he knew, not shame for where he worked. The truth was, Marcus could have been Francois. He had the knowledge, the passion, and the palate. During his time at culinary school, his professors had called him exceptional, particularly in wine studies. His thesis on the intersection of terroir and climate change in French wine regions had been published in a respected industry journal. He had been offered internships at renowned restaurants in New York and San Francisco. But when their parents died in a head-on collision with a drunk driver, Marcus faced a choice: pursue his dreams or ensure his 17-year-old sister could pursue hers. The life insurance barely covered funeral costs. Keisha had been accepted to Howard University with dreams of medical school, but dreams don't pay for textbooks and tuition. So Marcus took the highest-paying job he could find quickly: serving wealthy people who would never see his potential. He worked at Grandview 3 nights a week, delivered for a catering company during lunch hours, and spent weekends bartending at wedding receptions. Every dollar went toward Keisha's education and their small apartment. For 18 months, he had been perfect in his invisibility. Never corrected a guest's mispronunciation of wine names. Never offered opinions about pairings, even when he watched people make choices that would ruin their meal. Never let anyone know that the quiet black man refilling their water glasses had forgotten more about hospitality than most of them would ever know. But tonight felt different. Maybe it was Keisha's call reminding him of who he really was. Maybe it was watching Victoria Ashford treat him not just as an employee, but as something less than human. Or maybe it was the realization that his invisibility had become a prison he had built for himself. As he stood there, holding the bottle of Chateau Margaux, a wine he understood better than the woman dismissing him, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He straightened his shoulders, looked directly into Victoria Ashford's eyes, and chose to be seen. Because sometimes the most radical act isn't revolution. It's simply refusing to be invisible anymore. And in that moment, Marcus Thompson decided that his dignity was worth more than his job. The silence that followed Marcus's wine expertise stretched across the dining room like a held breath. Crystal glasses paused midway to lips. Conversations died mid-sentence, and even the soft classical music from the corner. Pianists seemed to fade into the background. Victoria Ashford's face had progressed from flushed to deep red, her perfectly applied makeup unable to hide the rage building beneath her composed exterior. "Excuse me?" Her voice was dangerously quiet, the kind of calm that preceded a storm. "Did you just correct me?" Marcus felt every eye in the room on him. The other servers had stopped their work, frozen like deer sensing a predator. Francois, the sommelier, stood near the wine station with his mouth slightly open, caught between Admiration for Marcus's knowledge and horror at what he had just witnessed. Even the kitchen staff had begun to peer through the service windows, sensing that something unprecedented was happening in their carefully ordered world. Richard Ashford sat motionless, his weathered hands still folded on the white tablecloth, but his eyes, sharp and intelligent behind wire-rimmed glasses, were focused intently on Marcus. There was something in his expression that hadn't been there moments before: curiosity and perhaps recognition. "Ma'am," Marcus continued, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "I was simply trying to reassure you that you did receive exactly what you ordered. The 2005 Chateau Margaux is an exceptional wine, and I wanted to ensure you could fully appreciate its qualities." Victoria pushed back from the table, her chair scraping against the marble floor with a sound that made several nearby guests wince. She stood slowly, her 5'6" frame somehow seeming to tower over the entire room through sheer force of indignation. "In 30 years of membership at this club," she announced, her voice now clearly intended for every person in the dining room, "I have never been so disrespected by the help. Not only do you serve the wrong wine, but then you have the audacity to lecture me about it? Victoria!" Richard's voice was quiet, cautionary. "Don't Victoria me, Richard." She whirled on her husband, her pearl necklace catching the light as she moved. "Are you going to sit there and let this waiter embarrass your wife in front of our friends?" Marcus stood perfectly still, his training in professional service warring with something deeper, a sense of self-respect that had been dormant for too long. Around the room, he could see the faces of club members watching this unfold. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed to be enjoying the drama, and a few appeared genuinely shocked by Victoria's behavior. At table 12, an elderly woman named Eleanor Westbrook, old money, older manners, shook her head slightly and whispered to her companion, "Gracious, Victoria, such a display." But Victoria was beyond caring about decorum now. She had been challenged by someone she considered so far beneath her that his very existence of knowledge felt like a personal attack on the natural order of things. "I want this man fired," she declared, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Immediately. I want to speak to the manager, and I want him gone tonight." Marcus felt something break inside his chest. Not his spirit, but the last chain of fear that had kept him silent for so long. He looked at this woman, draped in wealth she had never earned, surrounded by luxury she had never built, demanding the destruction of his livelihood because he had dared to demonstrate knowledge she couldn't accept he possessed. "Mrs. Ashford," he said quietly, and something in his tone made the room grow even more still. "I apologize if my knowledge of wine offended you. That was never my intention." The words hung in the air, and everyone present could hear what he hadn't said directly, that her offense wasn't at being wrong, but at being corrected by him. Richard Ashford's chair scraped against the floor as he slowly stood up. At 6'2", even at 62, he commanded presence in any room. His success hadn't come from inheritance like many at the club. He had built his real estate empire from nothing, starting with a single rental property and growing it through decades of 18-hour days and calculated risks. "Marcus," Richard said, and the use of his name, something Victoria had never bothered to learn, caused a ripple of surprise through the room. "What did you study before you came to work here?" The question cut through Victoria's tirade like a blade. She turned to stare at her husband, confusion replacing rage. "Richard, what does that have to do with—" "Everything," Richard said simply, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "What did you study, son?" Marcus hesitated. For 18 months, he had kept his education, his dreams, his true self locked away like a shameful secret. Sharing it now felt like standing naked in front of these people, exposing not just his knowledge, but his broken dreams, his sacrificed ambitions, his carefully hidden pain. Culinary arts and hospitality management. Sir, at Johnson and Wales University. A murmur went through the room. Johnson and Wales wasn't just any school. It was one of the most prestigious culinary institutions in the country, known for producing world-class chefs and hospitality professionals. "And what was your specialty?" Richard pressed, ignoring his wife's increasingly frantic attempts to interrupt. "Wine studies and restaurant management, sir. I wrote my thesis on the impact of climate change on French wine regions, with a focus on Bordeaux varietals." The murmur grew louder. Several guests exchanged glances. This wasn't just a waiter who had gotten lucky with wine knowledge. This was a trained professional working far beneath his qualifications. Victoria's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. She looked around the room, seeing the expressions on her friends' faces changing, from supportive to uncomfortable to something approaching disapproval. The narrative she had been crafting, of an uppity employee who needed to be put in his place, was crumbling before her eyes. "Richard," she hissed, grabbing his arm. "Sit down. You're making a scene." But Richard Ashford had spent his life recognizing talent, potential, and the kind of quiet dignity that couldn't be taught. He saw it in the way Marcus stood straighter now, not with defiance, but with the simple courage of truth. He saw it in the knowledge that had spilled out, despite every social pressure to remain silent. And he saw something else. The same look he had worn 40 years ago when he was a young man with big dreams and no connections, trying to make his way in a world that judged him by his background rather than his potential. The difference was, Richard had been white in a world that gave white dreams the benefit of the doubt. "No, Victoria," Richard said quietly, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent room. "You're the one making a scene." And with those words, the battle lines in the Grandview Country Club dining room were drawn. In his cramped studio apartment, 15 minutes from the club, Marcus sat on his second-hand couch, still wearing his server's uniform, staring at the framed diploma on his kitchen table. The glass was cracked from the last move, but the words were still clear. "Johnson and Wales University confers upon Marcus Emmanuel Thompson the degree of Bachelor of Science in Culinary Arts and Hospitality Management, magna cum laude." Next to it lay a leather portfolio, worn at the edges from countless interviews and job applications. Inside were letters of recommendation that painted a picture of a young man destined for greatness in the culinary world. "Marcus possesses an extraordinary palate and an intuitive understanding of hospitality that would make him an asset to any establishment," wrote Chef Martin Rodriguez, his mentor and the head of the wine studies program. The apartment told the AIG story of dreams deferred. Wine reference books were stacked against the walls. Hugh Johnson's World Atlas of Wine, Jancis Robinson's Oxford Companion to Wine, Kevin Zraly's Complete Wine Course. These weren't books for casual interest. They were dog-eared, highlighted, annotated with the intensity of someone who had planned to make wine his life's work. On the small dining table, business plans were spread out like a roadmap to a destination he might never reach. Thompson's A Farm-to-Table Experience read the header of one plan, complete with projected costs, menu concepts, and wine pairing suggestions that showcased his expertise. He had spent 2 years developing the concept for a restaurant that would bridge fine dining with accessibility, a place where knowledge of food and wine would be shared rather than hoarded by an elite few. Marcus picked up his phone and scrolled. to a contact he hadn't called in months. Chef Sarah Chen, his former classmate who now ran a successful restaurant in Portland. She had offered him a sous chef position just 6 months ago, with the promise of helping him develop his own wine program. He had turned it down, and she had stopped calling. The truth was more complex than he had allowed himself to admit, even to his sister, Keisha. When their parents died, the choice to sacrifice his culinary career hadn't felt like a choice at all. It had felt like survival, like love, like the only way to honor everything his parents had worked for. But somewhere in the 18 months of serving people who couldn't see his potential, he had begun to convince himself that maybe he had been fooling himself about his abilities all along. Tonight, standing in that dining room, correcting Victoria Ashford about wine, had felt like stepping back into his real skin for the first time in over a year. The knowledge had flowed out of him effortlessly, naturally, the way it used to when he was a student, when he was confident, when he believed in his own future. His phone buzzed with a text from Keisha. "How was work tonight? I've been thinking about our conversation this morning. You know, I'm graduating med school in 6 months, right? My residency comes with a salary. We need to talk about your dreams, Marcus. Really talk." Marcus stared at the text, remembering the morning phone call that had filled him with such pride. Keisha was 3 months from finishing her medical degree, already accepted into a surgical residency at Johns Hopkins. Everything he had sacrificed for had worked. She was going to be Dr. Keisha Thompson, and she was going to help people in ways he could only dream about. But lately, she had been asking harder questions. "What happens to your dreams when mine come true, Marcus? Did you think I wouldn't notice that you've stopped talking about food, about wine, about your restaurant?" The restaurant. Marcus walked over to a shoebox tucked behind his small bookshelf and pulled out a folder marked Site Locations. Inside were printed listings for potential restaurant spaces, some circled in red, others marked with notes about foot traffic, rent costs, and renovation potential. He had been looking at spaces right up until their parents died, had even put a deposit on a small storefront in a gentrifying neighborhood where young professionals were beginning to discover good food. The deposit had gone to funeral costs instead. He opened his laptop and navigated to a folder he rarely accessed anymore. Recipe Development. Dozens of documents appeared, seasonal menus he had created during school, wine pairing suggestions for each dish, cost analyses that showed how he could make fine dining approachable. There were photos from his final project, a 10-course tasting menu that had earned him the highest marks in his program and interest from 3 different restaurant groups. One photo showed him in chef's whites, holding a glass of wine he had selected to pair with a braised short rib dish. His smile, confident and genuine. He looked like a different person, someone who believed in his own future, someone who took up space in the world rather than apologizing for existing in it. The phone rang, startling him from his memories. The caller ID showed Richard Ashford. Marcus stared at the screen, his heart racing. Members of the club had never called him at home. Ever. He answered on the 4th ring. "Hello? Marcus, this is Richard Ashford. I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from the club directory. I wanted to apologize for my wife's behavior tonight, and I was hoping we could talk. Are you free tomorrow morning? Say, 10 o'clock? Marcus found his voice. "Mr. Ashford, Yes, sir. I'm free." "Good. But not at the club. I'd like you to meet me at my office. Ashford Development, downtown. I have a proposition for you." After Richard hung up, Marcus sat in the silence of his apartment, surrounded by the artifacts of his abandoned dreams. For 18 months, he had told himself that serving others was enough, that his sacrifice was noble. that dreams were luxuries he couldn't afford. But tonight, when he had chosen to speak his truth instead of swallowing it, something had awakened, not just in him, but apparently in Richard Ashford as well. Marcus looked at his diploma, his business plans, his recipe notes, and, for the first time in over a year, he allowed himself to wonder, what if his dreams weren't dead, but just sleeping? What if tonight had been the beginning of waking up? Richard Ashford's office occupied the top floor of a gleaming downtown building that bore his name in understated bronze letters. As Marcus stepped off the elevator at exactly 10 o'clock the next morning, he was struck by how different this space felt from the club. Where Grandview was all marble and crystal, designed to intimidate and exclude, this office felt like a working space, successful but functional, impressive but not pompous. The receptionist, a young black woman about Keisha's age, smiled warmly as she announced his arrival. "Mr. Ashford is expecting you, Mr. Thompson. Can I offer you coffee? Water?" Marcus had barely slept, alternating between anxiety about losing his job and curiosity about why Richard Ashford wanted to meet. He had arrived wearing his only good suit, the one he had bought for job interviews after graduation, now slightly tight after months of eating whatever he could afford between shifts. Richard's private office was large, but not ostentatious, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. The walls were covered with photos spanning decades, construction sites, ribbon cuttings, but also images that told a different story. Richard serving food at soup kitchens, speaking at community college graduations, shaking hands with people who clearly weren't country club members. "Marcus, thank you for coming." Richard stood from behind his desk, gesturing to a comfortable seating area near the windows. "Please, sit. Can I ask you something directly?" "Of course, sir." "Last night my wife embarrassed herself, embarrassed me, and most importantly, she tried to humiliate you for having the knowledge and courage to do your job well. I want you to know that her behavior doesn't represent who I am or what I believe." Richard paused, his weathered hands clasped together. "But I didn't ask you here to apologize. I asked you here because I recognize something in you that I remember from myself 40 years ago." Marcus waited, unsure how to respond. "I grew up in Youngstown, Ohio. My father worked in the steel mills. My mother cleaned houses. When I told people I wanted to build things, to develop properties, to create something lasting, they looked at me like I was dreaming above my station." Richard's voice carried the weight of old memories. "Sound familiar?" "Yes, sir. I had to. Learn that success isn't just about what you know. It's about getting the chance to show what you know. Last night, you took that chance, even though it cost you." Richard leaned forward. "Tell me about your restaurant concept." The question caught Marcus off guard. "Sir? You didn't study hospitality management to serve other people's food forever. You have a plan, a vision. I want to hear it." Marcus felt a flutter of something he hadn't experienced in months. Excitement. He reached into the portfolio he had brought, pulling out a folder marked Thompson's. His hands shook slightly as he opened it. Thompson's would be a farm-to-table restaurant focusing on elevated comfort food with an accessible wine program. The concept is to create an environment where great food and wine education happen naturally, where the staff shares knowledge instead of guarding it. His voice grew stronger as he continued. "The location I had identified was in the Arts District, where there's foot traffic, but rent is still reasonable for a startup." Richard studied the business plan Marcus handed him, his eyes moving carefully over projected costs, menu concepts, and market analysis. The silence stretched for several minutes, broken only by the distant sound of city traffic below. "This is solid work," Richard finally said. professional quality market research, realistic, financial projections, a clear vision for differentiation in a crowded market. He looked up at Marcus. What stopped you from pursuing it? Marcus told him about his parents, about Keisha's medical school, about the choice that hadn't felt like a choice. As he spoke, Richard's expression shifted from professional interest to something deeper, understanding, perhaps even recognition. My younger brother wanted to be a teacher, Richard said when Marcus finished. Smart kid, could have changed lives. But when our father was injured at the mill, Tommy dropped out of college to work. He never went back, spent his whole life wondering, what if? Richard was quiet for a moment. He died 5 years ago, still wondering. The weight of that statement settled between them. Marcus, I'm going to make you an offer, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Richard stood, walking to the window. I own several properties in the Arts District, including a space that would be perfect for a restaurant. I also have relationships with investors, suppliers, and the kind of network that can make the difference between a restaurant succeeding and failing. Marcus felt his heart racing. I'm proposing a partnership. You bring your vision, your knowledge, your passion. I bring capital, connections, and 40 years of business experience. We make Thompsons happen. Mr. Ashford, I don't understand. Why would you do this? Richard turned back to face him, and Marcus saw something in his expression that reminded him of his father, the look of a man who had worked for everything he had and recognized the same hunger in someone else. Because last night, I watched my wife try to destroy someone for having the audacity to be excellent while black. Because I've spent 30 years in that club, listening to people talk about giving back and helping inner-city youth, while they can't even see the extraordinary person serving their wine. Richard's voice carried quiet intensity. And because 40 years ago, someone took a chance on a mill worker's son who had big dreams and no connections. It's time I paid that forward. Marcus stared at the business plan in his hands. At the photos of the restaurant space Richard was now spreading across the coffee table. At the possibility of a future he had convinced himself was impossible. Your sister graduates medical school. In 6 months? Richard asked. Yes, sir. Good. She can be our first customer when we open. What do you say, Marcus? Ready to stop serving other people's dreams and start building your own? For the first time in 18 months, Marcus Thompson smiled with his whole face. Yes, sir. I'm ready. Word traveled fast through the insular world of Grandview Country Club. By the time the lunch crowd gathered the following day, the story of Victoria Ashford's public humiliation had been dissected, analyzed, and retold with the kind of gleeful precision that only comes from watching someone powerful receive their comeuppance. But it wasn't just gossip. The club's general manager, Patricia Holloway, had received 7 phone calls before noon, 6 from members expressing concern about Victoria's behavior, and 1 from Victoria herself, demanding Marcus's immediate termination and a formal apology for the incident. Patricia sat in her office, reviewing the security footage from the previous evening. She had managed upscale establishments for 20 years, and she understood the delicate balance required to serve wealthy clientele while maintaining dignity for her staff. What she saw on the recording was unambiguous: a professional employee being publicly berated for demonstrating expertise. The irony wasn't lost on her that the club's diversity committee meeting was scheduled for that afternoon, where they would discuss creating a more inclusive environment while apparently needing to address whether their own members understood basic human decency. At 2 p.m., Victoria Ashford swept into the club like an avenging angel, her designer heels, clicking against the marble floor with military precision. She was dressed for battle in a Saint Laurent suit that cost more than Marcus made in 3 months, her jaw set with the righteous indignation of someone who had never been told she was wrong about anything. "Patricia, I trust you've handled the Wiggy situation from last evening?" Victoria didn't bother with pleasantries as she settled into the chair across from the general manager's desk. "I've reviewed the incident thoroughly," Patricia replied carefully. "Mrs. Ashford, I need to ask you some direct questions about what happened." Victoria's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose. "Questions? The only question is why that man still has a job after his inexcusable behavior." Patricia had dealt with entitled members before, but Victoria's complete lack of self-awareness was breathtaking. "Mrs. Ashford, the security footage shows Marcus providing accurate information about wine service after you complained about receiving the wrong vintage. His response was professional and knowledgeable. I'm struggling to understand what disciplinary action you believe is warranted. He embarrassed me in front of our friends. He made me look foolish." "Did he? Or did you do that yourself?" The question hung in the air like a challenge thrown down between them. Victoria's face flushed the same. Deep red it had the night before, but now there was something else in her expression, a flicker of uncertainty. "I beg your pardon?" Patricia leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Ashford, in 20 years of hospitality management, I've learned that the quality of service isn't just about meeting expectations. It's about the expertise and knowledge staff bring to enhance the guest experience. Marcus demonstrated exceptional wine knowledge while maintaining complete professionalism despite being publicly criticized. If anyone should be embarrassed by last evening's events, it shouldn't be him." Victoria stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor in an echo of the previous night. "Are you suggesting that I was wrong to expect proper service?" "I'm suggesting that you received exceptional service and responded by trying to humiliate someone whose only crime was knowing more about wine than you expected him to." The words landed like physical blows. Victoria stared at Patricia, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. In her world, general managers of exclusive clubs didn't speak to members this way. They apologized, they placated, they protected the fiction that the customer was always right, regardless of evidence to the contrary. "I want to speak to the board of directors," Victoria said, her voice barely controlled. "This is completely unacceptable." "Actually, the board wants to speak. With you." Patricia opened a folder on her desk. "After last night's incident, several members contacted board chairman William Harrison. There's going to be a review of what happened, and your conduct will be part of that discussion." Victoria's composure finally cracked completely. "My conduct? I'm a founding member's daughter. My family has belonged to this club since before that boy was even born. And membership comes with responsibilities, Mrs. Ashford, including treating all staff with basic respect." Before Victoria could respond, there was a knock at the office door. Patricia's assistant entered with a nervous expression. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there are some people here to see Mrs. Ashford. Mr. Richard Ashford and Marcus Thompson." Victoria whirled toward the door as her husband entered, followed by Marcus. But this wasn't the same Marcus who had served her wine the night before. Gone was the invisible server's uniform, replaced by a well-tailored business suit. Gone was the deferential posture, replaced by the confident bearing of someone who had remembered his own worth. "Victoria," Richard said quietly, "we need to talk." "Richard, what is he doing here? And why is he dressed like a successful business owner?" Richard interrupted. "Because that's what he's about to become." Patricia watched this family drama unfold with professional fascination. She had seen marriages tested by much less. than public humiliation, and she could read the dynamics in the room like a well-rehearsed play. Marcus stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority that filled the room. "Mrs. Ashford, I came here to tell you something important. Last night, you tried to have me fired for demonstrating knowledge you didn't think I should possess. You treated me as less than human because my uniform and my skin color told you a story about who I was supposed to be." Victoria's mouth opened, but no words came out. "But here's what you didn't know," Marcus continued. "Your husband recognized something in me that you couldn't see. He saw potential, talent, and the kind of determination that builds successful businesses. As of this morning, I'm no longer employed by Grandview Country Club. I'm Richard Ashford's newest business partner." The color drained from Victoria's face as the implications hit her. Her husband, her own husband, had not only defended the man she tried to destroy, but had made him an ally, a partner, someone who would now move in their social circles as an equal. "Richard," she whispered, "you can't be serious." "I've never been more serious about anything in my life," Richard replied. "Marcus is going to open a restaurant that will put every dining establishment in this city to shame, including the one in this club, and I'm going to help him do it." Patricia cleared her throat. "I think this conversation might be better continued elsewhere." But Marcus held up a hand. "Actually, Mrs. Holloway, I'd like to say something to Mrs. Ashford before we leave." He turned to face Victoria directly, and she involuntarily took a step back. "Ma'am, I forgive you for last night, not because what you did was acceptable, but because holding on to anger about your ignorance would only hurt me. You'll have to live with the knowledge that you tried to destroy someone's livelihood because they dared to be excellent in your presence." His voice was calm, measured, final. "But I want you to remember this moment. Remember that the next time you're tempted to judge someone by their uniform instead of their character, you might be looking at your future business partner, your future doctor, or your future boss." The room fell silent. Victoria Ashford, who had entered with righteous fury and absolute certainty in her position, now stood speechless in the face of a dignity she had tried to strip away and failed to break. Richard placed a gentle hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Come on, partner. We have a restaurant to plan." As they turned to leave, Marcus paused at the door. "Mrs. Holloway, when Thompson's opens, you'll have a standing reservation. Thank you for standing up for what was right." The door closed behind them, leaving Victoria alone with Patricia and the echoing sound of her own assumptions crumbling around her. 3 months later, the construction sounds of hammers and saws echoed through what would soon become Thompson's restaurant. Marcus stood in the center of the space, wearing work boots and jeans, his sleeves rolled up as he directed the installation of the custom wine storage system he had designed. The transformation from his dreams on paper to this tangible reality still took his breath away some mornings. The space Richard had found was perfect. A corner building in the Arts District with exposed brick walls, high ceilings, and large windows that would flood the dining room with natural light. More importantly, it was in a neighborhood where people came to discover new experiences rather than confirm their existing prejudices. "The bar installation looks incredible," came a familiar voice from behind him. Marcus turned to see Keisha, entering through the construction entrance, carefully navigating around paint cans and electrical equipment. She had driven down from Baltimore, where she was completing her surgical residency, to see her brother's dream finally taking shape. "Dr. Thompson," Marcus grinned, using her title with obvious pride. "What do you think?" Keisha walked slowly through the space, taking in the custom millwork. the open kitchen design that would allow diners to watch their meals being prepared, and the carefully planned wine display that showcased Marcus's extensive knowledge. She stopped at a framed photo hanging near what would be the host station, a picture of their parents at their own wedding, young and hopeful and dressed in their Sunday best. "They would be so proud," she said softly. "Sometimes I feel like I can almost hear Dad giving me advice about the business plan," Marcus replied, "and Mom would have opinions about every design choice." The restaurant was scheduled to open in 6 weeks, and Marcus had spent every day since his partnership with Richard began throwing himself into the project with an intensity that bordered on obsession. But it wasn't the desperate obsession of someone trying to prove themselves. It was the focused passion of someone finally able to use all of their abilities without apology. The partnership with Richard had evolved beyond what either of them had initially envisioned. Richard's business experience and network had opened doors Marcus never could have accessed alone. But more importantly, Richard's respect for Marcus's expertise had allowed him to take full creative control of the culinary vision. They had developed a rhythm of collaboration that reminded Marcus of the best kitchen teams he had worked with during his training. "Mr. Marcus," called out Rosa, the general contractor's foreman, "the sommelier station is ready for your final approval." Marcus walked over to examine the custom-built wine service area, running his hands over the temperature-controlled storage units and the granite workspace where he would decant wines and prepare tastings. This was where the magic would happen, where his knowledge would transform from a source of shame in Victoria Ashford's world to a gift he could share with guests who came seeking new experiences. "It's perfect," he told Rosa, who beamed with pride at her work. His phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "Food and Wine magazine wants to do a feature on Thompson's before opening. Interested?" Marcus stared at the message, remembering the years he had spent reading Food and Wine in his apartment, dreaming of someday being featured in its pages. Now that possibility was real, tangible, within reach. He typed back, "Absolutely." "When?" The response came immediately. "Next week. They want to focus on your story, from server to owner. The journalist is particularly interested in the partnership angle and your wine expertise." Keisha read over his shoulder and whistled softly. "Food and Wine magazine? Marcus, do you realize what this means?" He did realize, and it was both thrilling and terrifying. The article would tell his story to a national audience, but it would also make him visible in a way he had spent 18 months avoiding. There would be no more invisibility, no more hiding behind a uniform, no more letting others underestimate him for their own comfort. That evening, Marcus and Keisha sat in his apartment, the same cramped space where he had dreamed of this moment. But now it felt different. The business plans were no longer desperate fantasies, but working documents. The wine books were no longer escapes from reality, but tools he used daily. The framed diploma was no longer a reminder of failure, but evidence of the expertise that had made his partnership possible. "I need to tell you something," Keisha said, setting down her glass of wine, a bottle Marcus had selected from his personal collection, saved for special occasions. "When you gave up your culinary career for me, I felt guilty every single day. Every A on an exam, every successful surgery, every step toward my dreams felt like it was built on the sacrifice of yours." Marcus started to protest, but she held up a hand. "Let me finish. I used to lie awake at night wondering if I should quit school, get a job, tell you to pursue your restaurant. But I realized that would have dishonored your sacrifice, not honored it. So instead, I promised myself that someday, when I could, I would help make your dreams come true too." She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "My signing bonus from Johns Hopkins. It's not enough to match what Mr. Ashford invested, but I want to be a partner too. A small one, but still a partner. Marcus opened the envelope and stared at the check. $25,000, representing months of her residence salary she had somehow managed to save. Keisha, I can't. Yes, you can. Because Thompson's isn't just your dream anymore. It's our family's dream. It's proof that sacrifice and love and hard work can create something beautiful. She smiled, tears in her eyes. Besides, someone has to make sure you don't put too many fancy French wines on the menu. Regular people need options too. Marcus laughed, pulling his sister into a hug that felt like forgiveness and gratitude and hope all wrapped together. 6. Weeks later, on opening night, Thompson's restaurant was packed with food critics, local diggers, and curious neighbors drawn by the buzz of anticipation. Marcus stood in his kitchen, wearing chef's whites that fit him perfectly, watching his team execute the menu he had dreamed of creating. At table 12 sat Richard Ashford with several business associates, proudly explaining the wine pairings to guests who hung on every word. At the bar, Keisha held court with other young professionals, telling anyone who would listen about her brother's expertise. And at the sommelier station, Marcus Thompson, no longer invisible, no longer apologizing for his knowledge, no longer serving other people's dreams, poured wine for guests who had come specifically to experience his expertise. The boy who had been told to stay silent had finally found his voice. 1 year after Thompson's opened, the restaurant had become the most sought-after reservation in the city. Food critics praised not just the exceptional cuisine, but the revolutionary approach to wine service, where knowledge was shared freely rather than gate-kept, where servers were encouraged to educate rather than simply take orders, and where the sommelier's expertise elevated every dining experience. Marcus stood in his restaurant on a busy Friday evening, watching the controlled chaos of a successful service. The awards on the wall, James Beard nomination, Wine Spectator's Award of Excellence, recognition as one of the city's best new restaurants, served as validation for every moment he had been made to feel invisible. Victoria Ashford had never set foot in Thompson's, but her husband Richard had become a regular, often bringing potential investors and business partners to experience what he called the future of hospitality. The partnership between the two men had grown beyond business into genuine friendship, built on mutual respect and shared values. Keisha, now Dr. Keisha Thompson, and completing her surgical residency, kept her promise to be Thompson's first customer, and had brought colleagues, friends, and eventually her boyfriend, a fellow surgeon who was impressed not just by her brother's culinary skills, but by the dignity and respect that permeated every aspect of the restaurant's culture. The real measure of Thompson's success, however, wasn't found in reviews or revenue, but in the staff Marcus had built. He hired servers based on potential rather than pedigree, offering training and advancement opportunities to people who, like him, had been underestimated by a world that judged ability by appearance. 3 of his servers were now studying for sommelier certifications, funded by the restaurant's professional development program. On quiet moments between services, Marcus would sometimes think about that night at Grandview Country Club, when Victoria Ashford tried to destroy him for daring to demonstrate knowledge she thought he shouldn't possess. Her attempt to silence him had been the catalyst for finding his voice. Her effort to diminish him had forced him to claim his full worth. The moral of Marcus Thompson's story wasn't just about overcoming prejudice or achieving dreams deferred. It was about the transformative power of refusing to accept someone else's limited vision of who you're supposed to be. Every time Marcus chose expertise over invisibility, dignity over silence, he had created space not just for his own success, but for others to step forward and claim their worth as well. Sometimes the most radical act isn't fighting back against those who try to diminish you. It's simply refusing to be diminished. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving your enemies wrong. It's building something so beautiful, so successful, so undeniably excellent that their opinions become irrelevant. Marcus Thompson had learned that visibility, chosen courageously, was worth more than all the safety that silence could ever provide.